And welcome to another week of Wandering Toward Wonder. My name is Will Green. I serve as one of the associate pastors and the director of discipleship at Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. And I'm grateful that you joined me for this regular Tuesday space in which we carve out some time to think about how we're cultivating wonder, hope, and joy in our lives. I'm tuning in today from my own little slice of Washington, D.C., here in Brightwood Park. I know that some of you are joining me from all over the place. Some of you are from right here in the DC metro area. But no matter where you're joining in from today, I would love to know where you're watching from. So whether you're watching live or you're watching later, drop a note in the comments to let me know where you're joining me from so that I can celebrate your presence here with me today. Uh, as we kind of continue gathering ourselves in toward the beginning of the fall and the program here at Foundry, there are so many exciting things happening. I want to make sure that you are able to stay on top of all of that. So if you've not already done it or you haven't heard about it, go to our website and register today for the great day of service that's coming up this Sunday, October 4th. That's going to be an opportunity for you to actually do in-person, socially distanced and safe meal packing at the church. We would love to have you join us. If you can't do that, you can join us virtually and provide a contribution to help virtually pack a meal, which is great. That same day in the afternoon at 4:30, there's going to be a very brief communion service in the plaza and an opportunity after that for you to come by and pick up elements for communion. There are a limited number of spots for all of the various ways you can participate, so we want to make sure that you get to register for that as well. We're going to drop the registration link in the comments on Facebook now so that you can register for that if that would be helpful to you on this World Communion Sunday. And finally, we want to make sure that you're staying regularly connected to all of the things that we're doing at Foundry in this season. You know, the great gift of being virtual is the opportunity for you to participate no matter where you're coming in from. And I know that there are folk from all over the country who are participating in our classes and in our small groups. So if you would, you can always come back to Facebook at 5 o'clock today to see a copy of what we call Connections. It's a weekly newsletter with all kinds of information about classes and small groups and other events, or you can register at the link we're going to drop into the comments section for the opportunity to receive that in your inbox. So that's a lot. We're going to take a breath as we kind of settle into our topic for the day. I've been thinking a lot about grief. And those of you who know me well, or many of my friends and family know that for a long time I've been really interested in questions about grief and loss and the way that we recognize and celebrate loss in our lives, or honor loss in our lives. That interest was born out of a class I took at college, Hendrix College, called The History of Death and Dying in America with Dr. Mark Shantz. And when I signed up for the class, it was really just a way to take a sociology requirement. But it became an experience that really shaped the way that I thought about life and death, and the way that we confront and hold grief in our lives. There were two authors in particular that were really formative for me. One was a woman by the name of Jessica Mitford. She wrote a book called The American Way of Death. And the other is a guy by the name of Philip Arias, who wrote a book called Western Attitudes Towards Death. And what was so formative for me is they both acknowledge and kind of lay out in very clear form the way that in Western cultures, and in America in particular, our obsession with exceptionalism, I have to be the best, I have to do the best, I have to hold it all together, I have to pull myself up by my own bootstraps, combined with the notion of a Protestant work ethic, that is, work hard as a representation of your faith in the world, has cultivated a kind of emotional constipation when it comes to grief, right? We have this tendency to commercialize and commodify grieving rituals, right? And so whether it's paying somebody else to do the work of grieving for us, or it is buying self-help books that try to help us talk ourselves out of the experience of grief, or it's relying on professionals to help us prepare and celebrate the dead. We have this tendency to want to keep ourselves as distant as we can from grief. And all of this, both Mitford and Arias argue, and I think is probably true, is this desire to really insulate ourselves from confronting the reality that grief happens. There's another word I could use for stuff that happens, but grief is one of those things, and grief happens. Mourning happens. Loss happens. And the pain it causes will be there no matter how hard we work to believe otherwise. No matter how many self-help books we buy, no matter how many professionals we hire to help us process and prepare ourselves for it, the fact of the matter is that deferred grief will eventually reemerge into our lives, erupt into our lives. And this is especially true not just of the death of a loved one, but also the deferral of dreams, hopes, visions for what the world might be that we all hold dear and deep inside us. I like to think about these kinds of death as little deaths. And many of us are regularly having to die to the world that we thought we were going to inherit, to the relationship that we held on to dearly, but that ultimately did not last, to the image of ourselves that we want to portray in the world, even though behind the picture we're all falling apart. These little deaths are always happening in our lives, some big, some small. But often, because of this other stuff that we've been talking about, this tendency to defer grief, we're not even aware of them, right? And all of this has been swirling around in my head during the season of pandemics, in which the normal processes available to help us hold all the grief, both individually and communally, that we are feeling, are unavailable. We can't rely on the familiar sounds of church hymns sung by a beautiful choir. We can't go to our places of worship and pray and reflect. We, in many cases, can't gather with those we love or engage even in the kind of backyard bonfire rituals that allow us to be fully present to the grief that we're feeling. And that's just for those of us that are dealing with these little deaths. We have to remember, too, that the pandemic of state-sanctioned violence, which continues to plague our nation and may feel more prominent now, has always been there, and it's never been safe to grieve when you're queer and black and brown and indigenous, because you've just got to keep on surviving. That's another conversation. My point in all of this is that as we continue to have these experiences of grief, we can't afford to continue deferring it. Because ultimately what winds up happening, at least I know this is true for me, is that the more we defer our pain, our loss, our hurt and heartache, the more that stuff has a tendency to begin to take root in our hearts and in our lives and in our relationships. And much like a pernicious weed, it begins to choke out opportunities for joy and life. It begins to strangle our spirits in a way that keeps us deflated and de-energized. It begins to overtake the vision with which we perceive the world, right? So that all we're seeing is this kind of constant, low-level, often subconscious experience of grief that we're afraid to confront because that's how we've been formed to deal with it. And as I've been thinking about all of this, the thing that's begun to give me life is in naming the fact that I've not been grieving in all the various ways that I've been experiencing grief. I'm suddenly opening up doors that allow me to feel the feels and to do the thing, to really be honest and confront, to turn my face toward and not away from those places where I'm feeling deep loss and fear and heartache and hurt. And in so doing, what I'm beginning to see is the way that God, when we open ourselves up in those spaces, is able to speak life and light into them. Because the more I confront them, the more honest I am with myself about the grief that I feel, about the hurt that I'm carrying, the less able it is to draw my attention away from where God is bringing healing in the midst of hurt, where God is bringing comfort in the midst of loss, where God is showing up in phone calls, in Zoom calls, and in faithful, fruitful ministries that are blossoming all around me at the church. I can't help but avoid them. I can't help but see them because I'm finally being honest about the world as it is. A few Sundays back, I preached a sermon called Not Today, Satan, very clearly a RuPaul's Drag Race reference for those of you who watch it. And in it, I talked a little bit about looking towards suffering and not away from it. How Peter, in the story from the gospel that we read, wants to avoid suffering at all costs. And what Jesus is inviting Peter to do is to turn his eyes not away from, but towards suffering, trusting that God doesn't just lead us up to the point of suffering and then abandon us, but that God goes with us into that suffering, into that grief, into that loss, and accompanies us as we journey through it. And the question that I continued to ask myself as I wrote that is, what would have happened if Peter hadn't turned his eyes toward the cross instead of away from it? What kind of life, what kind of growth would he have experienced, let alone would we have experienced as the church, had Peter not been able to turn his eyes toward the grief and suffering of which he was so afraid? And in so doing, to recognize and see the ways that even in the midst of the grief and loss and fear, Easter was imminent. I want to encourage you in this week, as we continue looking for all the ways that wonder speaks into our lives, to do something which may feel a little counterintuitive. I want to encourage you, rather than looking away from the grief that you're feeling this week, rather than just pushing through for the sake of pushing through, to carve out a little time each day and to open up the door behind which you've hidden all that grief and longing and angst and hurt, and look it in the face and name it for what it is. Be honest with yourselves about even the silly things that you're grieving, the loss of a birthday party or a wedding reception, let alone the other pressing griefs so present in our society. Be honest with yourselves about them. Name them for what they are. And then remember, before you close the door and go back to life, that God is not standing far away from you in that moment, but God is right there with you. And God is not only right there with you, but God's in the midst of the grief already. Beginning to, in all the ways that God does, make a way for us through it, if we're willing to follow. So this week, rather than looking for wonder in ways that bring lots of joy and life and laughter, perhaps there's wonder to be found in being honest about the grief and trusting that when we turn our eyes toward suffering, toward grief, toward our loss and our hurt, that God goes with us, and where God is, not only is resurrection possible, but it's as imminent and unavoidable as the rising of the sun. Friends, I hope that something that we've talked about today has been helpful to you. If you've got questions, if you've got thoughts, if you've got your own perspectives, I would love to know what those are. This is, of course, a journey that we're all wandering on together, so feel free to leave those in the comments. And certainly we hope that you will continue to join us here at Foundry each day during the week as we offer these live online devotions. You can join Pastor Ginger tomorrow at noon for her ponderings from the Purple Parlor. I hope you will avail yourself of that offering. And until then, friends, remember that God loves you, that we love you, to be gentle with yourselves, and keep wandering on toward wonder. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.